All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Hughes. I'm the Secretary of the Lafayette Alliance. And before we begin this evening, I just have a few housekeeping notes that I want to mention. As you can see on your screen now, we are in our inaugural speaker series of 2021, and we are excited to have you all here for the second presentation. We are honored this evening to have the good Professor Paul Spalding with us, who will speak on his book, Lafayette, Prisoner of State, and we will begin that here shortly. The next lecture that we will have will be on Friday, July 9th at 6 p.m., and that is with Mr. Julian O'Shea, who you can see pictured there here in LaGrange. We were honored to have him a year or two ago. It seems almost like a year ago, but I think with the pandemic, it was a little bit longer than that. We will have him speaking about the Lafayette Trail and his work, and also Lafayette's farewell tour through this particular area that we are within here as the Lafayette Alliance in LaGrange, Georgia. And then we will have the wonderful Dr. Linda McMullen to finish out the inaugural lecture series, and she will speak on Friday, September the 10th at 6 p.m. Look, when I tell you that we are fortunate to have Dr. McMullen, I truly mean it. We are fortunate to have her. She is the vice chair of the Lafayette Alliance and really is an idea creator, someone who comes to the table with much to add. So you don't want to miss that. She is going to be speaking about her view of Lafayette and her ideas on Lafayette as well. All right, and then we, of course, have a web presence. Many of you know that, but please visit us at LafayetteLagrange.org. In the next few weeks, we will have a subscription button there. You can join our e-blast and get those on a regular basis. And you can also go to LafayetteLagrange.org/inaugural speaker series to get the information to register for more of our presentations. Additionally, tonight's lecture will be recorded, and then within the next few days, probably by Wednesday of next week at the latest, we will have that uploaded to LafayetteLagrange.org/inaugural-speaker-series. So you can also go there to see this lecture again. And of course, we are on Facebook. You can visit us at facebook.com/Lafayette Alliance. And finally, just a little bit of being a proprietor, I guess, here. You will see that if you are interested in joining our membership, feel free to do so. You can do that at LafayetteAlliance.org/contact us, or just email me, alex@LafayetteLagrange.org. And like I said, we are absolutely honored to have tonight Professor Paul Spalding with us. And with all of that, and no further ado, I will turn it over to our chair of the Lafayette Alliance, Dr. Richard Ingram.
Professor Spalding, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Sorry, I have to unmute. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I see you got your IT professional to help you out there.
That's correct.
Good.
It's always hard to get started.
Listen, we appreciate your taking the time to be with us, and you have. I've
Thank you.
seen some of the slides that you're going to present to us, and it's spectacular. We will give you undistracted time, but before we do that,
All right.
if you would, give us the quick tutorial on, number one, how you came to Lafayette in the first instance. Number two, how you chose to write about this time in his life, his imprisonment for 5 years. And number three, I notice in the preface, you highlight the American Friends of Lafayette. Tell us a little bit about that organization likewise and your role in it. So first, how you came to Lafayette, the book, the AFL.
Well, I actually teach or taught in religious studies before I retired a couple of years ago. And I was very interested in religious dissenters. Europe back in those days, in the 18th century, was covered with regimes that had a state religion, whether it be Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist. And in order to enjoy full civil rights, you had to belong to that particular church. Well, I was following a particular dissenter who was helped by a family in Hamburg to hide from the imperial authorities because of his translation of the Bible, believe it or not. And as I looked at that family in Hamburg, it happened that I found a generation later, they were helping Lafayette while he was in prison. And I really knew nothing about Lafayette's prison period, so I started investigating. I found out that there was an Austrian archivist who had worked at the war archives in Vienna and published in 1878 kind of a cherry-picked overview of Lafayette's prison experience. I knew there was more to be found. And as I continued digging, I was able to get into the police archives in the Czech Republic and many other sources for this period. And I thought, we really have got to get down the details of 5 years when Lafayette was a prisoner of state. I don't think many Americans know that. And then later, he spent 2 years in exile in Northern Europe. So that's kind of how I got into this. And I've stumbled on the American Friends of Lafayette in the process. They soon, you could say, drafted my wife and me to be the co-chairs of membership. And we've been welcoming new members for the last 11 years. However, we just gave that up. So we're now just regular members. The American Friends of Lafayette was, I think, a much smaller organization years ago, but it has kind of set fire in the minds of many people who are interested in the early republic, of course, the War of Independence and the early republic. Once a year, we have a meeting in which there are historical tours. It takes place always in a spot where Lafayette was prominent, such as LaGrange, Georgia. There have been many times in Boston and other spots where he was active. Now, what was the third question you had?
Talk about the AFL. You have covered it. You
I've
have
covered
done,
it. Okay.
you covered it. And I particularly appreciate your laying it on thick for the AFL, because I appreciate Chuck Swam and Alan Hoffman promoting our series.
Yes.
So thank you very much. Let me just ask you, I notice here in the preface, you quote Lafayette talking about Adrienne, and this is the quote: her tenderness, her goodness, the elevation, delicacy, generosity of her spirit had charmed, embellished, honored my life. But here, you're not talking about Adrienne here, are you?
Well, Adrienne reminded me of my wife, who is also a very strong person who takes initiative and arranges what seems to be the impossible. Adrienne Lafayette was one of the great heroes of that period of time. She has an unbelievable story herself. There was a Frenchman who actually wrote a biography of her, and all I can say is she deserves as much praise as her husband in so many ways. She saved his life, I think you could say. And along the way, maybe I can explain why that was.
So this was a generous comment. I was trying to open the door such that you could compliment your wife,
Yes.
who is obviously the brains of the outfit and the
Yes.
IT genius in your house.
Yes,
Now,
she is.
That having been said, let's do this, if okay with you.
All right.
So you're going to launch. We have a lot of ground to cover, and it'll be
Yes.
undistracted, uninterrupted. And then afterwards, we'll talk and we'll question and answer then. How about
Okay.
that? All
That
right?
sounds great. I don't have a prepared text, but I will try the best I can to speak about this story from the visuals that I'll be showing. So at any time, Alex, we can get started. And thank you, Dr. Ingram, for inviting me to this. And thank you, Alex, for helping out so much. This is an imagined view. It's a bit of Lafayette propaganda, you could say. That is propaganda by his supporters as they were trying to get him out of prison. It's showing him being shackled by Prussian troops. This is the picture that most civics and history classes in junior high will not know about concerning the great hero of the American War of Independence from France, the Marquis de Lafayette. Next. There was a cascade of events after the American War of Independence. Within the decade, the French Revolution began, and Lafayette was caught up in it, hoping that he might serve as George Washington had served in the American War of Independence, to lead his country of France into a new era of democracy. However, there were people on many different sides of the political equation. Some of them were radical Jacobins, you could say. They supported the immediate establishment of a republic. Lafayette, as well as Ambassador Thomas Jefferson, thought that perhaps France needed a more moderate transition to democracy by retaining the king as a constitutional monarch. And a new constitution was established on that basis. The Jacobins were so angry, they carried out a coup in Paris. They slaughtered the guards at the royal palace, and they took the king and his family prisoner. Soon they would be executed by the guillotine. They were furious at Lafayette, and of course they were going to guillotine him as soon as they got their hands on him. At this point, he was the commander of the Northern French army, which was facing the Prussians and the Austrians, who were just about to invade France in order to restore the king to his throne. And he was at a place called Sedan, right along the border with Belgium, today's Belgium. He tried his best to get in communication with others to organize a defense against these usurpers, but even his own troops began to turn against him. He quickly got together some fellow officers and other soldiers who were sympathetic to him and took off across the border. Next. I like maps. The situation back in the 1790s geographically was different. The political barriers were much more complicated. Basically, what you're looking at is what is today's Belgium. Down below is Sedan, the town that was his headquarters, and the Austrian and Prussian counter-revolutionary troops had gathered in this area. The purple was actually Austrian Netherlands. That's what it was called. So the Austrian and Prussian troops were able to collect there. The yellow and green were supposedly neutral territories. They were ecclesiastical territories. So what Lafayette and his men had in mind was to slip right through that strip of neutral territory to reach the Netherlands in the north, and then eventually to get across to Britain, take a ship back to America. Next. Unfortunately, in the middle of the dark and deep Ardennes forest, he was arrested. And he was put up in a in an inn called at that time the Pelican Inn. It's now the Hotel Lafayette, and you can visit there if you wish. He was furious, of course, because he thought he had the right to walk through neutral territory without being arrested. Next. His ultimate captors were the King of Prussia and the so-called Emperor of Austria. He was Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which was kind of an early version of the European Union in Central Europe. His real power lay with territories that his family controlled, among them the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Kingdom of Hungary, the Archduchy of Austria. You'll notice the crowns next to him. One of them is the imperial crown on the left, and the one on the right, I think, is the royal crown of Bohemia, today's Czech Republic. He was a very young man, by the way, kind of naive. Next. Okay, I told you the geography was complicated. France looks pretty much today as it did back then politically. And then above it is a Belgium that actually was composed of different territories. What happened was that after he was captured in Rochefort, he was carried away. And Alex, you can just press the keys to show the route that was taken when he was under escort of Austrian and Prussian soldiers. Wesel was a big Prussian fortress he was held at for a number of months. And then he was moved to Magdeburg, and then down to Neisse, which was in Prussia. And the Prussian king got tired of holding him and turned him over to the Emperor of Austria. And he ended up at Olmütz, which he stayed at for about 3 years. In total, he was a prisoner of conscience for about 5 years, more than 5 years. Next. He was sentenced by a military tribunal to a sort of endless prison sentence. It was conditioned by the return of the king to his throne. And the expectation was they could turn Lafayette over to the French king for judgment, which probably would be execution. Next, he was declared to be an apostle of democracy, and this was a terrible crime. He was escorted down the Moselle River, past all these wonderful vineyards, and then down the Rhine River, next, to a Prussian fortress near the Dutch border called Wesel, and he was kept in the citadel of that fortress city, and the building actually still exists where he was held. Next. Today, the entrance to the ruins is through a gate with the Prussian eagle over it, and that building right behind the gate is where he was held. Most of the fortress is now destroyed, but the long building on the left, that is at the right photo on the left, is a Prussian military museum. Very, very interesting. Next. The French troops began invading the Rhineland, so the Prussian king decided he better move Lafayette and his fellow prisoners to the east. I say fellow prisoners because there were actually 2 others who were held as state prisoners, also friends of Lafayette, who had been in that military group escaping France. In any case, Magdeburg is quite a bit to the east, and they were held in a citadel on an island in the middle of the Elbe River. Next. Today, if you go there, you can't see any fortress, But if you're an archaeologist, you say, there is something under the ground, because at this traffic intersection, you find great big lumps of earth that cover the ruins of the former fortress. Next. Then they were moved far to the east in what is today Poland. It was called the town of Nysa. And you notice that these towns are all heavily fortified because of the warring that was going on in Central Europe, actually since the 17th century. This star-shaped fortress in the north was called Fort Prussia, and that is where Lafayette was held as the king of Prussia began to get really tired of holding him and wanted to turn him over to the Austrian emperor. The reason the king was especially tired of holding him was the king was turning his eyes from the west, facing France, to the east, facing Poland. He wanted to gobble up Western Poland, just as Russia was wanting to gobble up Eastern Poland, and Austria was wanting to gobble up Southern Poland. Just ask any Pole about that story. It was the destruction of the Polish nation. So in any case, the king had his attention elsewhere, and he just wanted to get rid of Lafayette. So next. Today, when you go to Nysa, to this fortress, you can still see ruins. Next. My wife and I were crawling around on these battlements in the rain, and we looked down in the inner courtyard where Lafayette had sometimes been walked for exercise. And there are Polish merchants who are now using these casemates, these inner rooms of the fortress to store their supplies. Olmütz, yes, go ahead. Finally, the Austrians pick up Lafayette at the border and take him in a carriage to Olmütz, which is now in Eastern Czech Republic. There was an ex-Jesuit college that had been converted into a barracks prison. And this is the location within the city. Next. It is beautifully preserved on the eastern wing. The University of Olomouc, the way the Czechs pronounce the town, is occupying the area. There's a church in the middle. This is a very Catholic area, of course. And then on the left was the prison barracks. Believe it or not, after all these centuries, the western wing is still a military installation. You cannot go in it. Next. This is what it looks like from the plaza. My wife and I walked into a bookstore across the way whose proprietor could speak English. And we asked about where this place was. He had no idea. We walked across the plaza and saw a plaque on the side of this building that said, "This is where Lafayette was kept." It was both in Czech and in French. In the time of Lafayette, there was he was brought into the prison through this entrance on the left, the carriage entrance. Next. Here's a bird's eye view of the complex. If you look at the top right, that's the carriage gate, and he was brought into the inner courtyard and then brought up to the second floor where he was given 2 rooms that were attached. He was, as you may have read, near the latrines of soldiers. Soldiers were barracked here on the floors above and below, and they used latrines on both sides of the wing. There was an open gutter with the effluent going right under his window. And he remarked on how bad the place smelled. Next. This is what the back wing looks like today. On the second floor, past the storm pipe, is where his rooms were. Next. We actually did get into this, this former prison barracks due to the wonderful Czech colonel who was commandant of the military archives that now occupy the building. Colonel Sklenovsky. And there is my wife talking with him as they look at the back. He had had no idea where Lafayette's prison rooms had been. The bottom two photos are what Lafayette saw outside one of his windows. Down below are some bastions, and then over to the right, there was a military hospital, now part of the University of Olmütz. Colonel Sklenovsky told us that we could not take pictures inside because it is still a secret archive. Next. As Lafayette was imprisoned, his supporters began a campaign, and it turned out to be an international support network. And I would say the most important centers of supporters would include our capital at that time, Philadelphia, London, where there were many French emigres, as well as British Democrats, you could say. Hamburg, which was the largest city in Germany at the time, and it to this day has counted as the most democratic city of Germany. And then finally Paris, where of course he had many, many close friends. Next. I'd like to emphasize some female supporters, including Angelica Schuyler Church. If you saw the musical Hamilton, she is one of the characters. She really had a thing for Alexander, who was her brother-in-law. She eventually married down, I mean, a lesser person, you could say. He was John Barker Church, who had been a commissary general in the Continental Army during the War of Independence. He became rich doing that, and he returned to Britain and became a member of Parliament. So here was an American woman who was very wealthy, living in the London area, and she was very close to Lafayette. She had known him personally, of course, in America, and she helped to sponsor the most important attempt to help him break out of prison. Next. She hired an escape agent on the left, Justus Erich Bollmann, who's an very interesting character. He deserves his own book, I think. He grew up in the German Principality of Hanover, which actually was British, because the British king came from the House of Hanover. And Bollmann was a very, very intelligent man. He went to the University of Göttingen and got a medical degree, but then he got caught up in the French Revolution. He went on a grand tour to France and was so thrilled with what was happening. He learned fluent French. And then when the Jacobins carried out a coup, he helped to smuggle out the royal Minister of War to England. It was a very, very adventurous story. In any case, he turned out to be just the person to try to smuggle Lafayette out of Olmütz. When he was snooping around Olmütz, he also went to Vienna, and he ran into an American medical student named Uji, I think that's how you pronounce it. And this is the most extraordinary coincidence because Francis Kinloch Uji had been a little kid when Lafayette first landed in South Carolina in a marshland. There were some African American slaves who were fishing for oysters off the coast. And they were the first Americans that Lafayette, Baron de Kalb, and others on that ship met. And they went to the nearest plantation house, which was the plantation of Major Benjamin Uji, the father of Francis. And Lafayette bounced this little boy, Francis, on his knee. Francis actually remembered that. So Bowman convinced Francis to join him in trying to help Lafayette break out. Next. This is there are quite a few details here. Since they were both medical doctors, like Dr. Ingram, they had a special collegial relationship to other people in medical care. There was a prison surgeon who they convinced to pass notes to and from Lafayette. He really didn't know that they were political in nature. They were encoded and so forth, but they managed to alert Lafayette that they were present. And yet another detail is that the emperor decided to let Lafayette go on excursions into the surrounding countryside under military escort, because Lafayette had been having a lot of health problems, and the emperor did not want to be known as having presided over the death of this very important person. Well, one day when the carriage was driving Lafayette out into the countryside, Bowman and Uji pounced and they fought with the escort. Next. The little X in the bottom left is where this happened, north of Olmütz in the wheat fields. They got Lafayette onto a horse and said in English, which was an exotic language in this part of the world. No one else knew English, so it was a code. They said, "Get off to Hof." Hof is that little village way off on the right, the upper right. And they had a carriage with a secret compartment waiting there. Yes, thank you. So unfortunately, Lafayette took that to mean get off, right away. So he starts galloping down the Imperial Highway up north. Unfortunately, at the first town, he continues going straight, which was the wrong direction. And he ends up in a forest, all lost and miserable. Next. This is my wife and I walked through this where Lafayette had gotten lost, and he ran into a tanner going home from work, and the tanner, the tanner knew this guy was a foreigner. He had a very thick French accent, although he had learned a little German, and the tanner got really, really suspicious. This was in a kind of situation like China, where you really had to turn in suspicious people or you yourself would be imprisoned. Well, he promises Lafayette that yes, he can get him a fresh horse at the next village. So he takes him to that next village, which is Braunschweig. In the lower right picture, that was one of the final scenes that Lafayette saw as he approached Braunschweig. Next. Unfortunately, the bailiff of that town had set a trap. The tanner had quickly run to him and told him that there's this really suspicious character. And so he was captured. He was returned to Olmütz, and this time he was put in isolation. All of his privileges of exercise were taken away. And by the way, later on, when he went back to America in 1824-25, and he visited a new prison in the Philadelphia area that practiced isolating some prisoners, he was horrified. And he says, never, never do that to a person. Well, his savior was this wonderful woman he had married, who he had never really fully appreciated until now, Adrienne. She came from the Noailles family. Her father was the Duc d'Ayen, whom Dr. Ingram had talked about in his lecture. The Noailles family was the highest noble family in France after the royal family. They were extremely wealthy and privileged. Adrienne had some wonderful qualities about her that helped her to face the overturning of her world. She was very quickly imprisoned after Lafayette had fled, and she went to a series of prisons that ended up in Paris. She was basically in line to be guillotined. She experienced how her sister, her mother, her grandmother, and other relatives from the same prison were taken away to the guillotine. The only thing that saved her was the American ambassador, first Gouverneur Morris, and then his successor, James Monroe, who basically said, if you execute her, you are going to lose the last ally you have. The French Republic had no allies except possibly the American Republic. Well, she spends well over, I think, a year and a half in these horrible prisons, and she's finally released after the Jacobins are overthrown. And there's a new government in place. It's still very much revolutionary. But she manages to get a passport claiming that she is going to go to America. She does get her son, George Washington Lafayette, to America quickly to get him out of harm's way, and he is taken under the protection of George Washington himself. That's another very interesting story, because Washington had never had a son, and he had taken to the Marquis de Lafayette as kind of his honorary son. And later on, he was shocked to see the son of Lafayette, who looked just like the young man Lafayette, who had come to America at age 19 and been made a major general in the Continental Army. There were two daughters of the Lafayettes, and Adrienne brings them with her on the ship, and they change course from America to Hamburg. They go up the Elbe River, and in the Hamburg area, she quickly makes contact with Lafayette supporters. Some of them could not believe that she was there. Of course, the upper class, even in Germany, spoke French, so there was no communication problem. She hires a Swiss carriage driver. She buys a carriage, and this Swissman is bilingual. He can speak German as well as French. And she and her daughters begin a carriage ride way across Germany. Can you imagine? And she makes her way to Vienna. You can look on a map to see how far away that is. And she manages to get an audience with the emperor. She claims to be Madame de Motier. And the emperor says, well, that's a familiar name, and she's an aristocrat, and let's see who this woman is. And when she enters, he's totally shocked. He's, remember, a young man. He's in his early 20s. And she appeals to him, will you please release my husband? And he refuses to do that, but she says, okay, then let me and my daughters go into prison with him. The emperor has been brought up with a certain courtesy that was typical of nobles, and his heart was touched, and he wanted to show himself as the best he could be. And he said, all right, I'll agree. But if you leave forever. So she and her daughters travel to Olmütz with a pass by the emperor. And I try to understand what it was like as they came in the door of this man's prison room. Excuse me for being emotional, but this poor Lafayette, he was skeletal, and he thought he was going crazy when he saw his wife and daughters. But in any case, she was able to stay with him and give him comfort and to be a companion. And his daughters were able, from their own prison cells, to come over once a day. Okay, now we turn to political events that were happening. There was a young general named Bonaparte who was given what was thought to be kind of a second-rate command over the army, the French troops in Italy. And he took full advantage, and he began attacking the Austrian troops who were in northern Italy, winning victory after victory after victory. He crossed the Alps and chased the Austrian troops to the gates of Vienna, and the Austrians were forced to make a peace treaty with him. One of the stipulations was the release of Lafayette. Next. I have, again, with the powerful women that were supporting Lafayette, I do have to mention Madame de Staël, who was Lafayette's very powerful lobbyist in France. She was probably the most articulate human being on the face of the planet at that time. She had been a little girl growing up in a very sophisticated household where her parents brought the top intellectuals to the dinner table. And so her vocabulary was a multiple of everyone else's. It was said that Napoleon Bonaparte was intimidated by only one person, and that was Madame de Staël. She was pressing and pressing and pressing for her friend Lafayette to be released. And Bonaparte probably would not have made this that much of a priority in the peace treaty if it had not been for the pressure that she brought to bear on the directory that was running France. Next. Let's look at his release. Could you press a button? Yeah, he was finally released and under military escort to Hamburg, which was a sister city of a smaller twin in Denmark, Altona. This is hard to imagine, but when you left the western gate of Hamburg, you entered Danish territory. Hamburg itself was a merchant republic, an independent merchant republic. And he was released into the hands of the American consul there, the US consul. He was told, however, by the emperor that he had to leave Hamburg within a couple weeks. And so he and his family went to Holstein. This is Hamburg as it, yeah, go, that's fine. I'd love to say more, but it was on the Elbe River. This is where ocean-going ships were able to reach. So it was the major northern German port. It was a very, very interesting city, full of, full of the Enlightenment, It had the major newspapers. Still to this day, it's the publicist center of Germany. Next to it was Altona. When Lafayette entered the harbor, or was crossing the harbor into Hamburg, next, this is what he saw. There was a gatehouse there, and that's where he first stepped on land as a free person. American ships were in the harbor, and they were all tooting their horns and flying flags. And there was a huge crowd awaiting him. Next. He moved with his family further into Denmark. The province was called Holstein. It's now German, but there was a city named Plön where his maternal aunt, the Marquise de Lafayette, had an estate. She was a very smart lady who had gotten out much of her fortune as the revolution began, and she was able to buy an estate in Holstein to wait out the war. So that's, and also the sister of Adrian was living on that estate, the Marquise de Montagu. So they had family there. It was a great place to go. Next. Plön is a city surrounded by lakes. That palace in the center was there when Lafayette was there. He did live for a time on his aunt's estate and then moved to an estate that he rented, but then came back to his aunt when the money was running out. He often came into Plön for groceries and to talk with friends. There was a noble living in one wing of this palace, the Duke of Oldenburg, who was crazy, supposedly. He had been forced to go into retirement in this palace while others took over his regency. And Lafayette often had lunch with him and apparently got along just fine. And then in the other wing of the palace was the Danish administrator of this area, a fellow named Hennings, who became a very close friend of Lafayette. And he was also related by marriage to the Lafayette supporters in Hamburg. Next. Now, the estates where Lafayette lived are now gone, but there is one estate that he visited that we also visited because it has the archives from the Marquise de Lafayette's estate. If you go to the entrance of this manor house was existing at that time. You see below the stairs, there's a little entrance to a cellar, the wine cellar. Well, there's no wine there anymore, but it's full of boxes of manuscripts, and included among them are the archives of the estate where Lafayette had stayed for many months, the estate of his aunt. The Baroness de Fürstenberg, von Fürstenberg, allowed us to go here, and there was a private archivist who was helping us to sort through some of these things, but it helped to tell the story of his exile. Next. After about a little more than a year, France was politically in a situation where they were willing to allow Lafayette to approach closer to his homeland. They said, you can come to the Netherlands, but no closer. So the Danish bailiff in Plön sold him a carriage for very little, and he went in disguise and under the name of Motier, which was pretty much unknown, to Utrecht, which is in the center of Holland, and then by canal, of course, to a little village south of there where his daughter and her husband had meanwhile moved. His daughter had married the younger brother of one of Lafayette's fellow prisoners. So next. This is an old picture of Fianen, and there was a vacation home that his daughter and her husband had been renting. In Dutch, it means, let's see, outside pleasure, I think. But it was just outside the walls of this little village. Next. Today, this village is beautifully preserved. It's a place I really recommend people to go to. Lafayette regularly would take a skiff along the canals north, up on the top of the picture, to Utrecht, which was a big city, and where he could enjoy the companionship of some people he had gotten to know. Also, French soldiers were there, and they almost to a person were delighted to meet Lafayette. In fact, when some of them came down to Fianen, one of them actually bribed the authorities to allow him to stay overnight with the Lafayettes in that rental house. There were other French who were very much against Lafayette, so it was a complex picture. Next. Finally, Bonaparte, who has returned to Paris, carries out his own coup and overthrows the directory that had been running France and establishes what was called the consulate. There were 3 consuls, and he was consul number 1. Adrienne had returned to France in the meantime. Also, she was able to do that. And she pleaded with Bonaparte to allow her husband back, but he didn't think that was a good idea because he was worried about Lafayette's political popularity. He was kind of a political rival. But Lafayette waited and waited a few weeks, and then he said, well, forget this. And he took a fake passport to use to get across into France. And he showed up in Paris one day. Bonaparte was furious, but he knew he could not force Lafayette to leave the country because of the political popularity that Lafayette had. And Lafayette also promised, I am going to go to the chateau that my wife has managed to recover. You know, the nobles who left France lost all their property. The state took them over, the properties, and some of these properties had not yet been sold to other people. There was a chateau that her mother had passed on to her that was still unsold. And next, it was a place about 40 miles to the southeast of Paris, out in the countryside of the province of Brie. And it had been completely gutted by the revolutionary forces, probably local peasants who tried to strip it of everything possible. And it would be many years that Adrienne and her husband would work on restoring this place. And I am betting you don't know the name of this chateau. Any guesses? La Grange. This is the place that was named after a town in Georgia. No, I guess it was the other way around. But anyway, it is a place that you all want to visit someday. Thank you very, very much.
Professor, that was spectacular. Now, listen, I want to extract all information I can out of you. I know we're at the bewitching hour, and some folks may do excuse themselves, But if you have time, I want to ply you. I don't mean it sound like a dental procedure, but I would like to ply you with some questions and learn from you. And if folks need to excuse themselves, that's fine. You have a few more minutes. Here we go.
Sure, sure.
Ready? So first, I am curious. 5 years in prison must change a man. Lafayette was Roman Catholic. Was he a religious, a spiritual man? And your observation, did it change him 5 years?
Actually, he was never really a devout Roman Catholic. He was a Roman Catholic by baptism because that was simply the way all French people were baptized unless they absolutely refused, and then they would be stripped of a lot of their civil rights. Try to imagine that Protestants could not even marry officially. They were under, if you had a Protestant marriage, you were understood to be living in sin. And they couldn't go to university and all these horrible things. Lafayette in 1790 joined with the French assembly that had come into power with the revolution and voted to lift all restrictions on Protestants and on Jews also, so that they could become full French citizens. He was a very tolerant person. When he went to Philadelphia, he ran into a lot of Quakers, and he would go to a Quaker prayer service perfectly happily. And he would go to other Protestant churches as well as Catholic churches. He didn't really find this to be a matter of great concern to him. Now, Adrian, his wife, was a very devout Catholic, and she was always trying to get him to read more devotional material. She was kind of working on him, to make him a better Catholic. But I think to the end of his life, he just remained a very open-minded person. He didn't have anything against the church, but he did want to work with a very cosmopolitan group of folks in both America and France.
When he was at Rochefort, Lafayette and his men signed a declaration at Rochefort.
Yes.
What was the content of that declaration, and does it still exist?
Oh, yes. It was a protest that they were escaping the Jacobins and that they felt they had the right to go through neutral territory to the Netherlands. That was basically the content, and they all signed their names. So we know exactly who was in that band of soldiers.
As I count up, Lafayette moved to 11 different prisons when he started going from Rochefort to Olmutz. Why all the moves?
Well, there was too much going on in the West. The French turned out to be very effective militarily. This was the first time there had ever been a national draft. And it was unheard of. The anti-revolutionary armies were all full of poor guys who had no other opportunities. Sometimes they were dragged off the streets. But in France, people were marching to the Marseillaise, and they were filled with the excitement of a new era where every human being was considered to be of equal dignity. And so they really were kind of at the, you could say, the apocalypse of creation, where the new rule of God was coming in. They, of course, thought in very secular terms. So they were far more effective fighters. And the generals were chosen no longer by their noble background, but by their effectiveness on the battlefield. So these, this is why the French armies basically took over Europe step by step by step.
At Namur, Commandant Lieutenant Colonel Marquis Gabriel de Chastelet addressed Lafayette as Marquis, and Lafayette chided him, called him on it.
That's right.
Why?
in 1790, the French National Assembly decided to abolish all noble titles, and Lafayette agreed. And he said, from now on, I want to be known only by the title that I have earned, which is general. And he also took his noble name, La, one syllable, Fayette, and put those two parts together to make a commoner's name, Lafayette. So he himself would correct people. No, I'm not Marquis de Lafayette. I am General Lafayette. And so properly from that time, he really should be known as with a singular word, no division within it, Lafayette.
And just a capital L, no capital F. Is that correct?
No capital F. No. It's
Okay.
all just Lafayette.
All right. Now, after Namur, there was Nivelle, where Cabinet Minister Lieutenant General Count Friedrich von Schulenburg carried
Yes.
away a sword which belonged to Lafayette, made of the bars of the Bastille. Where's the sword today?
Okay. Lafayette was a bit plundered at the beginning. The Austrian authorities were surprised that he had not carried off the military chest with a huge amount of money. And he said, that tells me that you would have done that in my position. It totally says something about you. But they did plunder a little bit, a few souvenirs. And among them was that sword. Lafayette later, after his release and after his return to France, 7 years later, he actually wrote the Prussian general von Schulenburg and said, I have a personal attachment to that particular sword. Would you not return it to me? And Schulenburg, again, as a nobleman, had a certain standard of courtesy, and he said, well, yes, I will. And so he did return the sword, and it is now, it exists in France. And I did make a mistake thinking that it had ended up in Lafayette College. That's another sword that had been impounded. I think there were a series of weapons that Lafayette had owned that were impounded during his imprisonment. But most everything was given back to him. Let that be said, including his money, including a gold repeater watch, things that the criminals would be happy to get their hands on. But these aristocratic military people had a kind of collegiality, a certain decency in approaching one another. May I give you an example of that? General Cornwallis and Colonel Tarleton, they actually were members of Parliament when Lafayette was imprisoned, and they both called for the British government to exercise pressure to release Lafayette. And one of the reasons was that Lafayette, in the surrender at Yorktown, had been so decent with them. He had returned the sword that Cornwallis had given over to, I think, General Lincoln, who had represented George Washington. And he tried to provide for Cornwallis in every way he could so that he could ease the calamity of having lost the war. So, and later on, Frederick the Great of Prussia invited both men to his dinner table, and he wanted to make a bit of a joke by seating them next to each other. He thought they would beat each other's throats. On the contrary, they were the best of friends. They had a great conversation. So there's really a special courtesy, I think, a military courtesy that was there in the 18th century among military officers.
So you do talk about that. I might add, you tell a great story. It was March 13th, 1794 in Parliament that there was a motion that George III intercede with Berlin And in
Yeah.
fact, Cornwallis supported that motion, and it was seconded by, you record, Bannister Tarleton.
Yes,
At the
yes,
time.
the infantry colonel.
Tell us a little bit about the Foxites, about Parliament, and about that whole British crew who
Yeah.
really supported Lafayette. Tell us a little bit about them. And that included folks who were emigres there in London and Britain.
Yeah, Charles James Fox was the leader of the opposition in Parliament. He was, you could say, very progressive, and he and his followers had, at the beginning of the French Revolution, great sympathy for the French Revolution. And by the way, in the American War of Independence, they supported the Americans fighting the British. They really helped eventually to bring about the British concession to let the colonialists go. So there were a number of such people. Let me say, that women were not allowed to be members of Parliament, but there was a duchess who was a big Foxite. She was Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. And she would go out into the countryside and into the cities trying to wage a campaign of voting for the Foxites. And she too became a very important voice, although an unofficial one, on behalf of Lafayette. That was a very important group. Let's just say that was constantly pushing for British pressure on Prussia and then later Austria.
So, and America. So it had to remain neutral, but it did put funds, it put money at Lafayette's disposal. How did
That's
they
right.
argue the legitimacy of doing that?
Well, first of all, of course, he had been a hero of the American War of Independence. He was the key person who brought in French support, open French support. The French Navy came. That's what led to the blockade of Yorktown and the final surrender of the troops of Cornwallis, the decisive battle at the end of the war. Lafayette had arranged all of that. He had gone back to France during the war to lobby for this. Let's see, what was the question again?
So how did they put money at his, and Angelica Church, I understand, was involved in putting money at his disposal.
Well, basically, George Washington was very concerned. We were still a third world country. We were a very young republic. In many ways, the world had not seen anything like this new country. And the superpowers were France and England, Britain. Secondarily, the Habsburg Austrians and the Russians, but we just didn't count for anything in the big world of politics at the beginning of our republic. We were very weak. In fact, George Washington tried to establish a navy for the first time. Just really basic things. So in that situation of threat, where both France and Britain would be happy to take our little nation and gobble it up, he followed a policy of neutrality, and he was very strict about that. All American diplomats were to remain strictly neutral so that we didn't get into any trouble. Well, that didn't mean that you couldn't, behind the scenes, do things that were anything but neutral. And basically, all the American diplomats in Western Europe got their heads together and said, okay, let's funnel some money to this guy and see what we can do to help him. Remember that this was in the days before email and before even snail mail, that went by plane or boat. Well, actually, they did have sailing ships, but it took an entire month for messages to get back and forth, and more than a month. So the American diplomats in Europe were kind of left on their own to decide immediate policy before they heard from Philadelphia. They did the best they could. They issued funds where they could. Most of it was on the basis of loans. That was kind of the ruse. Eventually, when Philadelphia was able to kick in, the Congress granted funds to Lafayette on the basis of his military service. Lafayette had refused any funds when he was in the War of American Independence. But now he really needed that money, and they sent him what they called a military pension. So this could also be claimed to be a totally neutral matter.
That was a spectacular detail you pointed out in there. So let me ask one final thing now. So initially, Lafayette at Nivelle, he was a prisoner of war. At Luxembourg, he was a prisoner of state. What is the difference, and what difference did it make?
Well, he became officially a prisoner of state by the judgment of the military tribunal in Luxembourg. The existence of Monsieur de Lafayette is not compatible with the security of the governments of Europe, that is the autocratic governments. And so at that time, he was called a prisoner of state. There was an official category, at least on the Austrian side, of such a prisoner. And in fact, when he came to Olmütz, he was not the first prisoner of state. There were at least 3 others that were there before. One of them was the Republican, French Republican Minister of War, who had been caught on the battlefield. So he was not unique in that category, but it was a kind of designation that allowed a state to cover up the reality that there was no true judicial process that was fair.
The medicines used, I was interested in your details there. What is spurge laurel, and how is that used?
You probably know, Dr. Ingram, that medicine back in the 18th century was a playful mess, you could say. Much of it was drawn from ancient Greek and Roman practice and understanding. Back in those days, they believed that medicine was based on certain liquids of the body, the humors, the 4 humors, and that an illness was due to the predominance of one humor over the others, and you had to take some of those humors out by bleeding or by causing a patient to vomit. There were different things that were pharmaceuticals, and some of them were somewhat effective, a diuretic or whatever, and they were typically taken from plants. Probably the most effective plant that comes to my mind was so-called Peruvian bark that the Incas had been using, and the Spaniards discovered that it was really good against certain fevers, and they introduced it to Europe. But that particular splurge, whatever it is called, is some plant among many, many, many natural plants that were tried out and were thought to be in some way effective. But most of this was what we would in modern medicine understand to be very ineffective. People were feeling their way blindly in medicine of the time.
Well, I thought it was an interesting detail that you included where Carl Haberlein, who was
Yes.
a Madeline physician there, but he would put on the poultice of Spurge laurel for vitality, is
Oh,
what
yes.
you had there.
Yeah,
Listen, this
okay.
book, for folks who have not read it, Prisoner of State, it is detailed and it is well worthwhile. And Alex is about to take over, but Professor, why not a second book?
Well, I was particularly interested in that period where I could draw, especially from German language sources. German is my second language. I read French, but most of the work on Lafayette has been via English and French sources. So I thought that's an area where I could make a contribution. And there are really good Lafayette experts out there who have a much greater understanding of many other chapters of his life. So I guess I didn't see a real contribution beyond that time of imprisonment and exile.
Well, this book is spectacular, and I particularly recommend chapter 6 on the escape. It is Martin and Lewis and Abbott and Costello is what it is. So I recommend it to you. Listen, I have about another 30 questions here. We'll have to save it for another time. I
Okay.
appreciate your taking time to be with us. And Alex, I hope you'll forgive me for running overtime. You've got the floor.
No worries. Professor Spalding, thank you very, very much. I have had the privilege of reading your book, and your summary tonight was wonderful. It was nice. It's always nice to hear an author's voice rather than read their words.
Thank you,
sometimes.
Alex.
So it was nice having you. We are going to open up the floor for questions. One way to probably do this the best is if you can find the way to raise your hand at the bottom of your screen or at your name, you can raise that too. If you want to raise your hand, I'll unmute you and you can feel free to speak to us. If that's something you're not comfortable with or unwilling to do, that's fine. You can just answer or ask your questions within the chat box or in the Q&A section. I'll be monitoring a little bit of everything for the next few moments here. So we will go here. Zeke, it seems that you have your hand up. Is there a question there? I will allow you to speak. Zeke? Oh. Okay, maybe not. Maybe that was an accident there. All right, but we do have one question coming in here, Professor Spalding. The question is in regards to Lafayette's imprisonment. You spoke about his almost being skeletal.
Yeah.
The question is, what was his weight before and after his imprisonment?
Oh, you know, I don't think I found anything like that. He was described by his wife in terms like that he had lost a great deal of weight. You know, I have to give credit to his captors that they did regularly feed him, but I think it was such an emotional time for him in isolation. The soldiers would not even talk to him, the ones that would come in and bring the food, and then they would leave. So I think maybe there was a kind of self-starvation that might have gone on.
Definitely. All right. And another question kind of is, you spoke a little bit about George Washington Lafayette and
Yes.
time with George Washington, but someone asked if you wouldn't just speak a little bit more about what was going on there. You kind of said, you know, it's a book within itself or a conversation within itself. So just a few more details about what he was doing during the time in which his father was imprisoned.
Okay. He came to America. He showed up, I believe, in Boston Harbor, and everyone was totally taken by surprise. George Washington heard about it, and he said, uh-oh, I've got this policy of neutrality, and if I accept him into my house right now in Philadelphia, the president's house, as it was called, I might run into some political trouble. So what he did was he arranged to have George Washington and his valet settle down on a farm in New Jersey for a few months. George Washington Lafayette, the teenager, kept writing George Washington on behalf of his father, and others were also working on Washington. And finally, Washington felt, okay, maybe it's safe to host him personally. And he brought him to his home, and he was very taken by him, just like he had been by his father. You know, these vivacious young Frenchmen were very different from the dour George Washington. But it was a, it was a kind of love of opposites. And George Washington even wanted him to stay after his father had been released, but George Washington Lafayette insisted on getting back home as quickly as possible, that is to Denmark, where his father was now living. And George Washington put him in his carriage, and he accompanied him all the way, I think, to the outskirts of New York to see him off. And he really was kind of like a forlorn father seeing his son going off to college for the first time. You get that impression. So that was some of the story of George Washington Lafayette. He later, by the way, maybe this is of interest, he later was just determined to have a military career. And this is one reason why his father decided to stay in Europe, because he knew if he went back to America, his son would insist on coming and would snuff out the military career he hoped to have in the French army. Initially, he joined a group of Dutch volunteers, but later on, when his father was back in France, he was able to join the French army. He became a lieutenant, and he actually did some heroic things in battle. He even saved the life of his commanding general. However, Bonaparte was jealous of Lafayette's father and didn't want his son to get anywhere, and he refused to allow this son to aspire to any higher rank. And the son finally quit the army, and happily, because he did not die in the snows of Moscow as a result.
Very true, very true.
Well, he later became a legislator, by the way, in the French National Assembly. He carried on the very progressive politics of his father. So he was an important figure politically well into the 19th century.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Professor Spalding, thank you so very much. We hope that that sometime when you're down in Georgia, that you'll stop by LaGrange, the place that reminded Lafayette so much of the chateau in France.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Come by and see us. If nothing else, make your way down here for the bicentennial of the farewell tour, and we'll be happy to host you here.
Okay.
There are actually, interestingly, many places in LaGrange now that are naming certain dishes after Lafayette. So it's really interesting. Like a Lafayette pie and Lafayette this and Lafayette that. So it's always fun to see what the new local restaurateurs come up with to represent Lafayette. And I think there's jalapenos on one of them. And
good.
I still haven't gotten exactly where the jalapeno is, but in Lafayette's character. So,
you've got a wonderful opportunity for branding, don't you?
Yeah, we do. It's,
go for it.
As Dr. Ingram says, it's a destination for Lafayette. That's what we're working on.
Good.
So, well, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Alex. It was an honor.
Absolutely. Thank you for everyone who attended tonight, and we will send you on your way. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.